to tell you a little bit more about their time when they were here at Harvard, what they're doing now, and the journey in that work. So sitting next to me, we have Celina Barrios-Millner. Next to her, George-Axelle Broussillon Matschinga, and a classmate of mine, a fellow mid-career from 2012, Khaleel Seecharan. So welcome, everyone. And looking forward to discussing this topic in conversation and hopefully going a little bit deeper. And I think building on the work that is connected probably to every aspect of public policy that we studied while we were here at the Kennedy School. So Celina, tell us about when you were back here and what you're doing now and how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came to the Kennedy School after having been in the social justice community organizing sector, and really my path to equity and inclusion work was shaped by my own experience being an immigrant from Venezuela and growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which at the time there were not any other Latinos in our K-12 school experience, so every test I had to check black, white, other. And when it turned out I was pretty good at school, I'm like, I want to represent for my people, and I just get to put other, you know. So, but that experience of navigating systems that didn't have me in mind made me really committed to helping others find their voice and their place. And so went into community organizing, working on a lot of social justice issues. And so I never really chose, just the same way that we didn't really choose to emigrate, we chose to move and ended up staying. I didn't really choose equity and inclusion as a track. I chose kind of representing my community and those left out, and the field sort of evolved around me. So now I recently started at the Urban Institute, a DC-based think tank, and I'm leading their new Office of Race and Equity Research to help equip policymakers and change makers with the tools to make policies grounded in equity and inclusion.
Amazing. Thank you so much. George-Axelle, I saw you bump into some of your classmates. I know they're here.
2017, so yeah. So yes, it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you again, Karen, for the invitation, and it's so great to see my classmates here. So my path is a bit different. So I started working in the field of D&I 18 years ago, and in France. So France, colorblind country. So it was at a time when diversity and inclusion was a brand new concept, very controversial. People would see it as something coming from the US, something threatening, something that would maybe take opportunities from others, so there were a lot of discussions around affirmative actions. And so I started at a time when major organizations decided to create and formalize a charter. They called it the National Diversity Charter in France. And then they realized that, oh my God, they had nobody to implement those actions in their organizations. And so they started creating different types of roles that we called at that time diversity practitioner or manager or leaders or whatever. And I had the opportunity to start at L'Oréal as, in the new team that was built to drive diversity and inclusion, not only in HR, but also in all the things that we were doing from a brand standpoint, from a communication standpoint, to make sure that we would reflect the diversity of the society and of the consumers we wanted to serve. So after that, after working at L'Oréal in France and also in Europe, in different countries, on a global scope, I truly wanted to strengthen my expertise in D&I, and what best than, the US and HKS. So I started my journey at HKS, and I was very fortunate to be elected by my classmates and some of the ones who were there in 2017 as, the VP of D&I for the students. And I had the opportunity to work with the deans there to see, which type of initiatives we could put together to make it work. So fast forward, I decided to stay in the US, and I had an opportunity to join SEPHORA, which is a LVMH maison, and to lead their D&I initiatives.
Okay, I just have to point out your nails, because for those of you who are familiar with SEPHORA, incredible makeup, but I was telling George-Axelle, I was just there the other day, and from the staff to the brands to the customers, you really see diversity, gender, race, expression. But I like this. You're bringing the glitter even here to the Kennedy School, which is amazing. Excellent. Thank you so much. And Khaleel, may I point out your socks if you don't mind? I just want to pull them up. Pull them up. Little R2D2 for the Star Wars fans. Yeah, amazing. Khaleel, take us back. You have a background not only at HKS, but also in academia.
Absolutely. You know, it was about 10 years ago, I was sitting in a seminar, and one of my classmates said something that was profound to me, and I ended up not paying attention to the rest of the seminar and just sitting with what was said. And what he said was, I am neither or, I am the hyphen in between. And that stuck with me, and I probably spent the last 10 years thinking about that statement, and that's probably why I'm sitting here today, which is the power of the community of the Kennedy School and the thoughtful people that you get to engage with that can push your minds and boundaries in ways that you probably aren't really expecting to take place. And you know, so I'm similar to Celina. I'm an immigrant, first generation. I came to the United States when I was 8. And for the longest time, the concept of home to me was Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I was born. And I very much remember turning 16 and really struggling with what my identity with home was. Because I was realizing that for the first time in my life, I'd spent more time outside of Trinidad and Tobago than I had in the United States. And I spent a lot of time in my life thinking about, well, how do I be Trinidadian and how do I be American? And when my classmate Salman said this, I was like, wait a second, I should just be the hyphen. And that was just really, really powerful. And it's been sort of just matriculating in my mind these last 10 years. And so when the events that were happening in 2020 of racial and social justice, I just finished another degree, and I was like, you know, if there's ever time to go do this, building on the skills and things I've done in academia and in higher education and in public health, this would be a space to now go out and play. And so I started my own consulting firm, which is really about organizational coaching. And so it's how to help other organizations figure out how to crack the DEI puzzle. Because everyone speaks to the values, and I do this with a lot of leaders who inherently espouse the values that they want, but they don't know how to turn that into their actual organizational steps and activity. And so being able to crack that nut and help do that has been really rewarding, and I've really enjoyed being able to do that. But it started really with that one comment. And so it starts with like me thinking back to my childhood and going, I really don't know how to do this. And when he made this statement, I spent the next 40 minutes like, oh, and really just starting to unpack what that meant.
This space does have acronyms, and I'm just going to break them down for anyone in the room or anyone online who isn't familiar with the lingo. So when we say DEI, that refers to diversity, equity, inclusion. You also may hear it called EDI, and there's some debate and discussion on which should come first, which is... But not die, yes. No.
Just for record.
Yeah, there's Jedi. That's justice, right? Justice.
Yes.
So there's Jedi. The one we use at the Walrus is IDEA, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, bringing that part into it. ERG also may come up, which is Employee Resource Group. And I say this because I think often when you're passionate about these issues, we start speaking another language, and someone who might be new is like, sorry, what does that mean? So we'll do our best to clock that. But it's also a good sign when acronyms are popping up because there's a mainstreaming happening, right? Exactly. In terms of how we talk about these issues. I have always felt that to truly do the deeper work of diversity, equity, inclusion, it's hard because you're looking at systems and you're surrounded by white supremacy, which is really important to name. And it's not easy work. So I'd like to hear some of the challenges that comes with the work and kind of like what we're up against, right? Celina, I'd be curious, and you also have a background in politics as well and in organizing. What are some of the challenges that come with this work if you're doing it right? Yeah. We shouldn't be scared of challenges. They're going to be there.
Yeah, so I did, prior to my immediate role, I worked for the city of Boston and had the honor to be there about 8 years, 3 mayors. 3 of those in the last year, with our mayor being asked.
Some Bostonians laughing.
Yes. Our mayor being asked to join the Biden administration as labor secretary. And in that gave a window of opportunity also to have our first Black woman mayor and our first now current mayor, Michelle Wu, first woman of color to be elected mayor. She's Asian American. And I think the challenge that we've seen is that you can't just have one person, right? You can't just have one leader, even if they're an amazing leader, and how to infuse equity into the business of government. And I think that applies to the private sector, nonprofit sector as well. And so how are you filling the potholes, right? Like how are you making your systems accessible by language? How it's not so much having the one person that's the touch point. And I think that over the last 8 years or so, maybe 10 years now, the city of Boston has done a great job of having an economic angle on equity, a human resources angle, a budgeting angle, so that we're infusing equity into all these processes. But I think it's really hard because these systems really have been established, as you mentioned, they've been built on white supremacy. They've been around for hundreds of years, and so how to disentangle all those pieces, whether it's contracting or whether it's how we're holding community meetings or any of that, you have to kind of peel all those layers of the onion while you're also responding to day-to-day crises and floods and political issues, and so doing that deeper work while also doing the day-to-day is really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. George-Axelle, you've been in the space for so long. I'd be curious, how did the challenges change over the years, right? Like what were the challenges when you started? I'm sure some of them are the same. And what are some of the challenges you're seeing now?
Yes, I love this question. So actually, and it ties back to what I said about, color blindness, racial inclusion. And what I have to say is that when I made the shift to SEPHORA, it was the first time ever I was working in a retail organization. So we are prestige retail, so we do have stores, more than 500 stores across the US. And obviously, I came from a brand perspective because I worked for L'Oreal in the past. I was much focused on the marketing, on all those things. And then I realized that, oh my God, our in-store experiences are racially biased. And you can think about your own experiences in stores, and I'm not speaking necessarily just about SEPHORA, but about any stores in the US. Racial bias is truly pervasive. And so last year, I published with my team a study on the state of racial bias in US retail. And it was focusing not only on SEPHORA, but on all major retail categories. And we found out that 3 out of 5 US retail shoppers had already experienced racial bias and unfair treatment in stores. That's huge. And then we spoke with BIPOC, so that's another acronym. Okay, BIPOC, it's Black, Indigenous, People of Color, so basically people of color. And they told us that 3 out of 4 BIPOC shoppers told us that marketing was failing even before entering a store, that they would not showcase a diverse range of skin tones, body types, hair texture. And then we spoke with the same group, and they told us, 3 out of 4 as well, told us that service was failing, that they were not necessarily in touch with people who looked like them, who had an experience with their ethnicity, who could serve them properly. And that's a problem. And when we spoke about, product assortment, and some of you remember in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, we had the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And obviously, what was pointed out was a lack of representation in product assortment, that we had Black people or people of color who would not find necessarily the product they needed, or they could not have access to it because it was locked. And we saw companies like Walmart saying, okay, we have to unlock the doors and things like that.
So you're referencing that, like, in pharmacies, in stores, there would be, for example, products for Black hair that was locked, other products were not.
Exactly. And so what is truly interesting is that when we had this study, we heard, so we disclosed it, it's published, it's online. We disclosed not only the findings on the negative experiences of those BIPOC shoppers, but also all that we as a brand, as a retailer, we would do to do better, to represent better. So we started working on our hiring policies, advancement policies, but also we signed the 15% pledge to dedicate 15% of our shelf space to Black-owned brands. We decided to look at our marketing, and we revamped our marketing guidelines to ensure diversity in front of and behind the camera. So we looked at the agencies we were working with. So it's really a holistic approach, but definitely still a big challenge in America, and a challenge that we cannot deny. And so that's why with the team, we worked to formalize a charter, and we talked about that. It's the first ever charter engaging more than 30 retailers to mitigating racial bias in retail, in US retail.
Round of applause.
Thank you. And that's something we did, thank you so much, but that's something that is so much meaningful. We did it with an organization called Open to All. Please look it up, it's a fantastic organization. And really what we are doing, it's not, of course we want to change US retail, but most importantly, we want to change the experiences of people of color entering a store and people of color who have to change their behaviors. And they told us that in our study that, well, when I enter a store, I feel judged by ethnicity. I feel judged by my ethnicity and 3 times more than white shoppers. And then we talked with store employees, and they told us, well, the primary basis of our interactions with clients of color are behavioral attributes, okay? So not ethnicity, not. And that shows really a gap in perception between those shoppers and store employees, and that's what we are trying to solve for, by different types of initiatives.
Thank you so much. Khaleel.
The trend in the last 20 years is really about this type of work and these types of offices, and the people who lead these offices going from what I like to call boutique functions to core functions. And so before it was a nice to have. Oh, you could have it and you could just have them do a glossy brochure, hopefully not with stock photos because I abhor stock photos. And now the cries for racial and social justice have really sort of said, no, this is no longer going to be just a pony and dance show. You really have to be really focused. And when I go in and work with leaders, I do a number of things that push them into a little bit of zone of uncomfortableness. So I usually ask, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because most people don't actually understand the difference between each of those 3 things. They just lump it all as diversity.
Do you mind speaking to that? Because I think that is common from your perspective. How is diversity different than equity and inclusion? Because I think it would be helpful for everyone to get that right in this room.
Well, for example, diversity means that you are bringing more diverse voices to the table. So, for example, in our panel, we have a breadth of diversity that's there. And inclusion is then making sure that once they're able to be here, they all have an ability to have their voices at the table, and their voices can be heard and respected. And then equity is also just making sure that you then treat them equitably. So oftentimes, and this is also one of the challenges with diversity, equity, inclusion, you have a person who's placed in a role because they are either a certain orientation, whether it's sexual orientation, gender, or race, but they might not be the most qualified person for that role. And what it does is it actually sets diversity, equity, inclusion back. So if you were equitably treating this person, you would say, wow, you're a wonderful representation of diversity. We've done a wonderful job of inclusion, but we're not being equitable to this organization. And that person should ultimately then be seen the door, because if they're not performing well, then they're not necessarily behaving the way they should. And so when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk a lot about retention and pathways that allow folks to be able to gain access at the seat of the table, and then once they're there, to be able to have their voice heard at the table, and then also to be able to perform excellent and well at the table. And so it can't just be, we need 3 people and let's just place them there and we've done our job, because that's not really, that's diversity, but it's diversity without inclusion and without equity. And that's really, really important. And so I challenge a lot of leaders to do that. I usually have them do a word cloud. They each write a sentence for each of these, and then I also ask them to talk about what's their organizational understanding of their mission for diversity, equity, inclusion. And what comes up is often very scary because it's not consistent. And so most leaders don't really understand why and what diversity, equity, inclusion is. The other piece is that there's a lot of unclear strategy and priorities. So I love George-Axelle's, or none.
Or none.
And again, this is the translation of going from a boutique to an actual core function, like you would expect to have real strategy and real priorities in how you go about doing this work. Another piece is the inadequate accountability. So what happens when this work isn't being done, and how is it being measured? And how do those measurements show that the work is actually making progress and impacting and improving the organization? I always view it as a yes and then it's a lack of a coordination. You know, I learned this term a couple months ago, boundary spanning, and it just blew my mind. Diversity, equity, inclusion officers, and George-Axelle's example is a perfect ways. She's boundary spanning across the organization. She's working with the retailers on the forefront, on the back end, with the people who are designing the makeup, with the people who are in the shops, with the people who are actually on the ground, with the retail stores who have their products in place. And so to put her in a box and say, you only have this narrow niche, her work actually impacts in and across the entire organization. And so when organizations want to achieve DEI excellence, it's important to recognize that DEI is a boundary spanning activity across all levels of the organization.
So well said.
Yeah. Love to hear about some success stories, big or small, but something that you were a part of or something that you've seen that you're like, yes, right? This is happening. Celina, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. So I think one of the success stories of my time in city government has been infusing the work of equity into the work of the chief financial officer of the city and the budget process, which is, you know, like how you designate your budgets shows where your values are. And so we're often talking about equity at the end of the year, like saying, oh, this is how we did, too bad, you know, we didn't do that well in terms of.
We don't have enough money is another common
or we don't
one.
have enough money, but actually building it in. So in your budget, are you budgeting for language accessibility for any materials you're putting out, any meetings you're doing? What's your supplier diversity plan, right? So if we give you this money, how will you spend it? Not you spent it, what did you do, right? So it's kind of like flipping it. And I think that, to me, that partnership with the chief financial officer, the budget office, the mayor driving this from the top, really means that now we're looking at things before we're looking at we're planning for the outcomes that we want by the way we allocate our budgets. And we're also sending the signal to departments like, this is going to impact what kind of funds you receive the following year. And so we really just, it took a couple of years, but we put it into place. All our metrics are going in the right direction in terms of hiring, in terms of supplier diversity, in terms of language accessibility. Before it was always like, we have a meeting, who has money to pay this translator, right? And so like, it really is putting it at the front end, and I think that applies really to any sector.
And that also comes back to, round of applause. I know that's both impressive and incredible work. It also comes back to the invisibilia sometimes in this work, because I think some people who might be new to the research or understanding would say, well, anyone can attend or anyone can apply or anyone has the opportunity. But as we know, there are a lot of structural barriers. So the example of language accessibility is a good one, which is if you want to attend a meeting to express, your voice, your opinion as a resident, as a citizen, but you can't, because you're not able to understand the meeting, and this is what's been incredible about online meetings, and again, hello to everyone who's joining us online, you can't get childcare, or you don't have access, right? Where's the equity there, right? So those features and those supports, that's what bring more people in to actually represent the community. I think too many community meetings don't look like the community, and that's around the world. So thank you so much for that example. George-Axelle, you have that great example you just shared, but we'd love to hear another success story.
Yeah, definitely. And we hope that it will be a bigger success story as a charter, because ultimately we will want to see more retailers sign. And we are working also with a series of stakeholders that are super involved, like the National Black Justice Coalition and other nonprofits, which is amazing. I want to build on what he said. So basically, I truly feel that one of the success I've had in my career was to make sure that I was not confined into a box. And that is super important when you lead. He said it, diversity and inclusion. I had the opportunity when I joined my company to work closely with the CEO and his direct reports and our C-suite basically at global level as well, to formalize a truly comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy, looking at what we do from an HR standpoint, but also from a supplier diversity standpoint, from a brand standpoint, and it was super important. And so with the team, we formalized that strategy. It is articulated around three pillars. So we have, we look at what we do from a workforce standpoint, a workplace standpoint, from a marketplace standpoint, and that's super important because at the end of the day, what is driving success is not only to have a diversity within each areas of the business, but also to have a strong collaborations with the different business units and stakeholders. And so with the team, I built, it's a monster internally because it's 11 initiatives. So I have 11 task forces working on those topics. And it's more than 100 people who are basically my extended team working on different topics, be it to, I said, to bring more Black-owned brands on our shelves, or to work on, our marketing strategies. We published a great documentary on Fashion Fair, on some of which is a Black-owned brands, on some of the work we've been doing. And what is truly amazing is that out of this collaboration, there is obviously amazing work, but there is also, and strongly, accountability. And what I managed to do with the team was to give, so everyone has a D&I objective. You spoke about accountability. I can tell you, my CEO has a D&I objective. Our store associates do have also D&I objectives. And at the end of the year, we look at what has been done. And then they get paid or not. It makes truly a difference because at the end of the day, everyone is held accountable. And I have calls from my peers, from other companies asking me, George-Axelle, how did you do it? Please tell me, because it's not frequent and you don't see that everywhere. So that's what I want to share.
Khaleel.
She just stole my answer. So, but what I will say is, my answer was institutionalized, right? Where DEI work is not led by an individual, it becomes ingrained in part of the culture of an organization. And when that is happening is when the work really begins to change the culture and improve the culture overall. So some of the examples, I help multiple organizations. One particular example that stands out to me was after the incidents of 2020, December 2020, we had a lot of cries on an institutional campus, and what we did is we put together a task force. But we brought in representation from across the institution that had faculty, staff, students, administrators, even alumni, and sort of said, there are no boundaries.
I love it, even alumni.
There are no boundaries. Dream, put everything down, and let's just dream of what we could think of, what we could do, but then also task them with accountability. And so metrics, what would it look like? What would a new center look like? What would faculty representation look like? And you lead often with data. Many institutions do not like to look at the data because the data doesn't show them in a positive light.
Or they don't have the data. I will say in Canada, a lot of organizations don't even have the data. And then the education, so people feel comfortable sharing data and trusting data, right? So it's all levels of this.
And there's a sense of uncomfortableness because you really are holding a mirror up to yourself and sort of going, wow, there are things I'm doing really well and there are things I'm not doing really well. Another institution I help support did this and started, so this is really speaking within the higher ed context, but their board, their external advisory boards, their vice presidents, their deans, and then down to each level, assistant, associate, down to the level. And for example, this institution had 237 external advisory board positions and 13 were BIPOC. Just 13. And that include all races that were BIPOC. So the representation and the feedback it was a bubble, right? That loop was just internal. But armed with that data, they could then say, wow, we're not doing a good job. And this is a majority minority institution in a majority minority city. But their external advisory board looked just that way. And that's across all their schools and colleges. And then the board of trustees also had some challenges as well. But it showed, and the data was harsh. And I commend that institution because they publicly shared it. I remember when it got released, and I went to the website, and I was like, oh, this must be the draft, and they're going to take it down.
Screen grab.
Yes, exactly. I was like, control save. And then a week later, I was like, oh, it is still up. And then I started sending emails. Did you realize this is up there? And they're like, yeah, we did. And I was like, huh, okay. And so then it was just really, really wonderful to see them be so authentic. And also recognize, wow, we know we're doing good work, and we know we have more good work to do. And our commitment is that we are not going to stop until we do better as an organization. And that's really refreshing to see, because you don't see that happen very often.
Yeah, I can't stress enough the importance of data. So I will say, from a Canadian perspective, we looked to the US, and George-Axelle, you mentioned this about like the West, but even within the West, we looked to the US because when it comes to media data, diversity newsrooms, you have the data. It might not be good, but you have the data, and it's being tracked. Last year was the first year we actually published data, was by the CAJ, the Canadian Association of Journalists, of what newsrooms in Canada look like. And it was a learning process, because you had smaller organizations like ours. We collected the data, but not everyone on our team was comfortable sharing it, especially if they are racialized, and they're one of the few. But it's a good learning overall, because we've been able to, through that first survey, educate everyone involved, right? Which get more organizations on, give feedback on smaller data sets, but ultimately hold our organization in the industry accountable. I'll add another just success story, something I've been involved with that is open to any organization, business around the world. It's the GDEIB. So we hired a consultant, her name's Kamal Bassine, and because we are a nonprofit media organization, she said, let's use this. It's a global diversity, equity, inclusion benchmarks, and it's free, it's available to any organization, but it allowed us to do an audit and to go through every aspect of our organization. So you mentioned procurement, right? Staff, taking a look at marketing materials, connecting it to sustainability, and to really see where are we and use that to create a roadmap and strategies. So there are great tools available, whether or not you are an organization of hundreds or thousands, or in our case, we're a team of 40. But I think that work and those frameworks are really helpful to be able to come up with a plan that you can bake in, ideally, to the strategic plan. Because if this isn't in your strategic plan, then that says it all,
and
doesn't it?
That's a great point, Jen. So my team and I developed and patented our own organizational DEI culture survey, which assesses an organization's readiness for culture. And it's a great map, because it's a 2x2, and on one side it looks from whether you're inward-looking, outward-looking, and then from top down is whether you are very creative or hierarchical. And what you often find is that there's a leader who's like all inside here, like we're off leading the charge, and we're heading a certain way. And then you assess the rest of the organization, it's like, actually we're on the other quadrants, and we're not necessarily moving as forward as you possibly can. And what's really interesting about when you do diversity, equity, inclusion work is everyone assumes that it's a static, right? But as you introduce new perspectives and new voices and new ways of doing work, your culture will shift and change over time. And so it evolves as that takes place. And it's been really fun to sort of deploy that. The other thing we did in preparation for our own launch is we looked at rubrics that assess DEI activities. And we sort of did our own version of best of, and it's across 8 thematic areas. And so when we walk into an org, we have a series of questions that also is like holding that mirror, and it's really uncomfortable. And so it's sort of like,
if you're doing it right, it should be very uncomfortable.
And everyone is always like, well, we want to get to the really nice idea that we can launch. I'm like, you can't get to the new idea if your foundation is not set. So let's get your foundation set. Let's make sure that if there are any cracks in your foundation, that we're filling them in and making sure that they're stable and sturdy. And now let's go play. And then the org culture aspect actually shifts when you go from the foundational work to the more exciting work, to the real bold idea that you then want to operate and execute against.
Amazing, thank you for that. We're going to come to audience questions, both in the room and online, after my final question for the panel. We're at a School of Public Policy, so I want to connect this back to policy. And for me, that has been the key. What is the policy, right? Because if you have a policy, then you can connect it to all those roadblocks that are just bound to come up. So at a policy level, what would you recommend, any advice for the policymakers here, what it takes to really advance it?
I mean, I think that the point we keep hitting on is just the important to invest at an institutional level, and to look at whatever your business is, right? So whether you're in government, I have a good friend who's a leader in this space, and he's in the healthcare space, and he's like, it's not just about who we hire, but it's how we deliver services to our communities. And
I mean, the pandemic was all about this.
Exactly. So I think that no matter where you're positioned, you have to develop policies that address your core business and not just how you look, right? Like what your leadership looks like or what your staff looks like. That's vital. Representation does matter. We see it time and time again. But you have to go further than that, and you have to make sure that those leaders or people of color that you bring in are being paid equitably, are not being marginalized, are not put in a corner to carry the weight of, undoing white supremacy by themselves. And so I think that, which we all kind of do as like, whatever your job is, you're also doing that, right? Like, so it's like, no, make sure people have the support and the appropriate compensation for that. So I think that, looking inside and also looking at what you're putting out in the world and making sure that equity is built into both.
I just want to say with the pandemic, like any pandemic exposes all the flaws in our system, but there was also some creative policy, both interventions, but also I think education. So I'll give you an example. I live in Toronto, and when we started rolling out vaccinations, there were priority groups, right? And that included immunocompromised people, older people, Indigenous people, but also people who are vulnerable because of their work. And it was so great to see, for example, vaccination sites set up on urban powwows, or there was one in my community at a strip club. And it's like, people will be like, whoa, it's like, this is where we need to set up the vaccine clinics, and that's what policy looks like in action. So I think we can learn a lot about like things that didn't work, but also some creative policies that we did see throughout the pandemic. George-Axelle, what are you think when it comes to policy?
I love the question. So I think that, and it's because I come from the corporate world and I've been, working also in this space for quite some time.
I like how you're like corporate world in this room, yeah.
Corporate world, out of the business. No, but I would say that it's very simple. For me, it's ask, listen, because you can ask and not listen, and then partner. And why I'm saying that, because it's something I've experienced, in my D&I journey and my work. When I mentioned what we had, what happened, and you experienced it, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I took time with my CEO, who had other things to do, and my chief people officer to listen to all of our Black employees. And then we listened also to our employees who are not Black, because we needed to capture the feedback. We needed to understand what was happening. We needed to document those lived experiences. And so I would encourage you to do that as well. You have constituents, listen, so ask what is happening, and then listen, and take the time to listen, and it takes time. And sometimes it's, for us, because I know that other D&I practitioners did it, it's a burden sometimes, because you have to listen, you're just like, okay, I'm not a therapist, I think I'm, but you have to do that, to do the work, because if you don't do the work and if you don't have the answers for those you are shaping the policies for, then it doesn't work. And so that's super important. And then partner, and that's what I'm super good at. It's to partner with, other people who are not necessarily from retail, who are, we work with a lot of non-profit partners. I set up an external D&I council with 25 leading voices in the field of social justice and racial equity. Why? Because I know that I do the work. I know that I listen to, we listen to our employees. But at the end of the day, I need to get feedback also myself. And so if you are as well, you don't take the time to get the feedback and to listen to the feedback, which is what I'm trying to do when I bring those nonprofits around the table. Hey, I tell them, this is our strategy, this is what we did, this is the result. So yes, we're super happy, we double the share of Black leaders into our stores in 1 year, or we did this, but we see that, we should, get stronger on promotions or things like that. Then I hear the feedback. And guess what? When you hear the feedback, then you collect the ideas to do better. And so that's why it's super, super important. So ask, listen, and partner.
That's great. Khaleel?
I run a webinar series, and I had one last month with policymakers on DEI, which was really interesting. And what
we love policymakers.
Well, yeah, so I made sure that was one of the perspectives that we were bringing to have to the table to have the conversation. So when I finish having this, usually I'm Jen in this instance. I usually have 3 bullets. In this case, I'll name 4. And so this was actually advice from them. which is really kind of cool. So these are people who do policy-making work, specifically within higher education around diversity, equity, inclusion. So the first one was find champions. There are champions everywhere who are already doing this work. Get to know them, understand what's important to them, and learn what they're doing, because they can help you understand how to crack the nut.
And that could be C-suite or it could be an intern, right?
Exactly.
Like it could be anywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also not just about within the level within the organization, but also who is doing activism in specific topics, right? So maybe it's, one of the challenges going on right now, Roe versus Wade, right? So it's on the potential chopping block. So if you were interested in having that conversation, who's out there doing this work? I know one of our mid-career classmates, Heidi Siak, is leading that with Voter Pro-Choice. And so if you were interested in doing that work, find Heidi, go talk to her, see what's taking place. The second is funding matters. There's lots of grants and dollars that are out there to be able to mobilize and gather resources to be able to move this work along. And no one's coming to your door going, hey, I have this grant that you could apply for. So mobilize, figure out what you can do, and look where those resources are, because they exist.
And get a good grant writer. There are people who write grants. That's what they do. They can get you money. Yeah.
No, what you need to do is get a good MPA ID and pay them. Pay them like a. Right, the MPA IDs are the secret to all success.
Yes.
And so the other thing is be aware of the political barriers and who are the political agents who will be working against you. So everyone walks in with a really idealistic way. Oh, we're going to go solve, this. There are people who are going to be actively working against you and have their own narrative, and you just need to be ready and aware for what that is. And that ties back to your champions. And the fourth point is step up and get involved, right?
Yes.
Don't stand on the sidelines. If this is really something that's passionate, and it's passionate to your organization, I talk all the time that diversity, equity, inclusion is unique to your own unique circumstance. So different organizations have different approaches for what DEI means to them and what their values are with DEI. And so across the three of us, we are all involved in this work, but we all do our work from different intersections, right? And so each of us approach it differently and have different ways in what we value and what we put support in, but that doesn't mean that any of the work that the rest of us are doing is diminished, right? It's all important, valuable work. But if we were each thinking about policy, we would all be thinking about this in three different ways. And so what's your space that you want to get involved and be active in?
I love that on Step Up. Sometimes I worry, and it's because I've seen it, that it's the same room for every DEI panel. So to anyone who's come to this conversation for the first time or second time, in person or online, thank you. And I think it's on all of us to invite that friend who's not interested or think it's not in their line of business. I love the CFO example because it just, I think it's a traditional like, oh, that doesn't involve me or that doesn't involve finance. There's a space. So there's an opportunity for all of us to step up and start doing the work. All right, now we're moving to audience questions. And I don't know about you, but one of my favorite things about panel discussions and talks here in the forum was this line. Just a reminder that a question is a short sentence that ends with a question mark. I use it all the time in my moderation, and I will tell you, Canadian audiences love it. We're also going to take online questions as well, so I'll go back and forth. If you'd like to start with the first question, please introduce yourself as well as your year in program.
Sure. My name is Marvin Benton. I am on the alumni board. I am also assigned to our diversity committee on the board. I am mid-career MPA, 1988.
Nice.
I appreciate the comments as you talk about focusing on how to improve the city, how to improve organizations. But I'm going to ask you a much tougher question. We've had a recent spate in this country where people of color are being attacked, physically attacked. Okay? Your head must be in the sand if you did not hear about what happened in Buffalo, where 10 people were brutally shot and killed. We've had other recent incidents like that. South Carolina a few years ago, a young man did the same thing, went into a church and killed about 9 or 10 people. Based upon your knowledge and experience, panel, and this is for each one of you, how can society do a better job in protecting people of color and avoiding these type of heinous acts where people are beaten and killed?
Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. I'll take a stab at it. It starts with having conversations. and opening a dialogue and opening a space of curiosity and compassion. I was telling the story, I don't know because I've been here for 3 days and I've told too many people too many stories, but I was in a Uber and I was trying to protect my Uber rating, but I was like, oh hell, I'm going in. With a driver who was of a different political persuasion than me, and we had a really, really difficult conversation about race and diversity and equity inclusion. I did the exact same thing. I said, do you know what diversity, equity, inclusion is? And so he makes a blanket statement. I said, well, can you tell me the difference between diversity and then equity and then inclusion? And he could not, so I helped explain what those three things were. And he talked about his own experiences of how someone was promoted in this organization looked a certain way. But the real uncomfortable part was we started talking about politics, and he very clearly made his views known, and I very clearly made my views known. And what I left him with was, and so I'm just gonna be really candid, what I said to him was, someone who looks like me, when I look up in the highest office in the land, I don't often see someone who looks like me. And so for anyone who was born in 2000, and when they reached around the age of 8, when you start to learn civics, and you saw that Barack Obama was president, in their mind, the only version of a president that they'd ever known was a black man, right? So he immediately said that was a racist statement. And I said, okay, that's great, well, let's keep going. And so I said, but before Barack Obama, every other president was a white man. And he then said, well, that's a racist statement. I said, is it a racist statement or is it a factual statement? And so he paused and he thought. And without directly impugning him, what I basically said is, there's a large population of white men who, when they started to see in the highest power of office that there was someone who didn't look like them, who experienced a sense of anxiety and uncomfortableness. And what I said to him, which is what made him really stop and think, was I said, so for those 8 years, those white men who had to face and deal with that level of uncomfortableness, that's the first time they've had to go through that. From the moment I was born and I opened my eyes, that has been my existence and my story. And so my challenge to him was, I said, so you could take that uncomfortableness and anxiety and realize that others are having the same exact challenge. You can actually use that as a bridge rather than as a divider. And he didn't speak to me for the rest of the ride. But I think it's not because the discussion, I think I forced him to start thinking about something that he had not perhaps thought of before. And so you have to be willing and brave to engage in that conversation, because he easily could have been dangerous, he could have done something negative to me, or worse, he could have given me a 1-star in my Uber rating, which would have been really, really unsettling. And so, because I'm protecting that 4.88 as much as I can.
Stop bragging.
But, so I don't know if that makes a change, but I certainly made him think, right? And I hope that in making him think, that forced him to perhaps take a closer look at the values that he has. I'm not saying he needs to come over to my side, but at least he begins to understand, wow, the same level of anxiety and comfortableness is happening on both sides. And that actually can be and should be a connector rather than a divider. And so how do we go about doing that? I don't know how to do that in broad spaces, if I'm being candid, but I was able to, and I was willing to try and do this with this one individual.
Because you've asked each of our panelists, we have quick answers from both of you. I just wanted to get to more questions, but I would love to hear George-Axelle.
Yeah, so I totally agree with what he said. It's really about opening the dialogue and having the conversations. That's super important. And as you do that, coming from a place of curiosity, but also to give grace, because I think that there are people, they want to have the conversations, but they don't know how to start. Or they fear that they will say something and then, oh my God, I will be labeled as a racist, and so I don't want to go there. And so it's really about, as well, giving grace so that people feel comfortable tackling those very sensitive matters. So in addition to that, obviously you were asking how to protect those communities. So I speak from a corporation standpoint. There are a lot of things that we did that I saw other companies do as well, which was to donate to different organizations, to raise awareness through communication campaigns. There are a lot of things that I think the corporate world can bring and can do also with the policymakers to make sure that those issues are seen, that the problems are addressed, and that more importantly, that the solutions are co-design, that is not coming just from one side or the other, that we put everyone around the table, and that's super important also what he said, so that we hear each voice, and at the end of the day, we come with a collective and very meaningful solution. And so I think that doing that can help, definitely.
Thank you for the question. I think it's been in my heart and mind every day, and I think that we still live in an America where a black child walking with a bag of Skittles is a threat, but a white man that's regularly posting and doing manifestos and is allowed to buy weapons, is allowed, and we have one that Trayvon Martin, who was executed, and there's been no repercussions for that, and we have I don't know the person's name, and I'm not going to learn it, was apprehended and is alive and can tell his story, right, who murdered 10 people in cold blood and injured others. And so I think that we still have a lot of work to do to value Black life in terms of our criminal justice system, in terms of our discipline in schools. Like, we have to do it at every level. Every news story about this incident talks about this white young man. I'm like, why is he a young man? Because he's 18, but a Black kid who's 16 is a man, right? And so it's like
and a mugshot always used in the media article.
Right. And so like we have to every time we have to keep, and people are getting, news organizations are getting more savvy. They're learning. So, but at every instance,
thanks to activists.
But I do think that we can't let any of those instances slide, because what happens is that it lowers the value of one life versus another, and it makes it possible to do that. And we do obviously have to be countering this wave of white supremacy backlash that's been happening, I think, as you said, since Obama was elected. But I think we have to work together on that, and I don't think there's a single answer, but we have to tackle it in every way it shows up.
I'm just going to add, as someone who grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is just across the border from Buffalo, white people, we have to talk to white boys. We have to talk to them. We have to ask about the video games they're playing. We have to say, who's that new friend? What are you doing? What's on your phone? Even if they don't want to talk. We have to talk to them. We have to talk to white girls. I'm not worried about the non-binary kids. We'll talk to them about other things, but we have to talk to these kids because it's happening in the basement. It's happening in our homes. So just thank you for bringing it up, because this is real, it's happening now, and it's deadly. We have an online question, and this is one I think that a lot of us wonder about. How effective are cultural diversity initiatives and trainings, and do they work? George-Axelle, you just made a face. I love that you went like this.
Because I've heard that so many times. Even from the leaders I work with, we want to do a D&I training, but it doesn't work. So I can say that it depends. Obviously, there are a lot of articles from our friends across the river who wrote HBR and all this. But I can speak about something that I saw, and that was super effective. When we ran the study, I spoke about that, the racial bias in retail study, and I spoke about the gap in perception that we saw between BIPOC clients, so clients of color, and our store associates who were, not necessarily BIPOC. We realized that we had to do a better job at equipping our store associates at Sephora and even beyond in retail with the tips and tools they needed to better serve, to better understand the needs of clients of color. And we have research showing that, yes, they want minimal wait times, yes, they want someone familiar with their needs, yes. So we do have facts showing what they expect from the in-store experience. So we have that. And when we brought that into a training, and obviously in the training we disclose the key findings of the research, we disclose what clients of color want in store, and we also give them an ability, and so that's why I'm thinking that it works. We give them an ability to role play, and that's super important, because sometimes we can say, yes, but it's a training, it's 2 hours, it won't work, people will forget. But we saw that by applying new techniques such as role-playing, such as giving scenarios, de-escalation scenarios, for instance, in instances where they had to deal with a racist client, or we saw that it was much more digestible and much more effective. Another thing that is super important to understand is that when we speak about training, we speak about learning. But there is a huge piece that we don't see, and it's unlearning. And this takes time. And when, for instance, so I speak about retail because that's where I'm working right now. But when we hire store associates, they come with what they were told to do before. So if it was, I don't know, using the N-word or having codes to speak about employees of clients of color, we have to unlearn, and that takes time because we have to give them also the we have to explain why it's a bad behavior and give them time to unlearn those bad behaviors. And so I think that there are a lot of things that we see when we think about D&I training, but the biggest piece is unlearning, and organizations should give time to their employees to do that as well.
Over here in the room.
Sri Kulkarni, mid-career, 2017. So first of all, representation matters, so thank you, George-Axelle, for representing for our class. My question is related to the last two and maybe a little bit more specific. So one of the big things that happened during our year was the 2016 election. And I remember, we had a class WhatsApp group, and at one point I said in the class WhatsApp chat, hey, we can't use this all just for a pro-Hillary chat. And somebody messaged me privately and said, Sri, I'm so proud of you for outing yourself as a conservative so early on. And I said, I'm not a conservative, but as a progressive, I think my values are protecting minority rights, and you're a minority here, so I'm trying to protect your rights here. But I say that not just humorously. I know for a fact that the conservatives who were in our class would say that all the time, that they felt like they were not part of this institution, that they were being attacked all the time, right? But having said that, we also know that there's equal and opposite reactions to everything. So when we talk about 2020, now we have all these bills to ban CRT, and all of the negative reactions to that. And we sort of talked about this, in the last question and with your comment about the Uber driver. But I guess what I'm getting at is specifically in the
question mark is coming, right?
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Specifically within the organizations that we're working in. I'm in a government agency. We do these DEI trainings, but when I was here, some of the folks who I thought were most resistant to this when we did the implicit bias training, or we did the, when we did these trainings, they were looking at their phone, they were kind of like rolling their eyes a lot. I noticed it, And the same thing happens in government agencies that I'm in. I'm sure it happens in corporations. The people that are most resistant to it, how do we address them? Are we just preaching to the choir, even in our own organizations? And if not, how do we get to the people who literally, they clap when someone passes that anti-CRT law? That's my question.
Yeah. So I love that question. And before I answer it, I just want to give a shout out to Sri, because I remember, he said, he talked about the 2016 election. I was also elected as VP of D&I, as I said. And I will always remember receiving that email from the Republican caucus telling me, well, George-Axelle, on the day of the election day, we were silenced. So how do you deal with that? And I want to really applaud Sri, because he was the first in our cohort to really bring the Republicans and Democrats together and to have those type of very difficult and uncomfortable conversations. But they need to happen, because at the end of the day, we need to hear every voice, and every voice matters. So to answer your question, Sri, it's not easy, but I come, as I said, with a very corporate lens and business lens, and what I bring and what I put on the table is the business case, and I really drop it like this. Like, oh, okay, you want to do business. That's good. But
I can picture you in the boardroom. I can just picture you doing
No,
it.
but really, but did you know that clients of color who feel unwelcome in store, by the way, they will represent more than 50% of the US population in less than 20 years. So do you want to be dead or out of business, or, Or, it's about really bringing the facts, and bringing the facts to, those people and they know that, it matters to their expertise. So it's about bringing them the facts and say, okay, so those are the facts. This is the landscape. This is how the demographics will impact your business. This is how the demographics will impact your policy. This is how the demographics will impact your voters, by the way. So let's have the conversation.
Okay. I'm going to get to another audience question, this one online. Thank you so much for that. This is regarding the Kennedy School. Someone writes, during our year in the MCA-MPA program, this is one Khaleel and I are part of, back in 2011, 2012, this person was struck by how little mention there was of race and gender inequality in courses on leadership, public management, etc. Has this changed at the school? Be curious if anyone has any thoughts. I will say, as someone who has come back, I've worked as a coach on one of the January term classes. I noticed that there has been a greater expectation and pressure coming from the students, and that professors and curriculum has responded as a result. I still think there's a lot of deeper work that's necessary, but would love to hear from the three of you what you know or what you've even seen since coming back, a decade later.
I do know he has two of my names. Khaleel Mohammed has a new MPP course, and I think that's one of the tracks that's being introduced to the MPP program around racial equity and the study of racial equity. And it's a track you can take. I don't know much more than that, but I do know that that's one new program that the school has certainly applied. You know, I think one of the things that is always great about the Kennedy School, and also in academia in general, students lead, students push and shape and cajole academia into where society's headed. Because, you know, if you think of someone who got their PhD 20 years ago and is in academia and got tenure 13 years after, you know, they're not refreshing and updating their curriculum and their values on a consistent basis. So you have that going as long as they've got these tenured roles, and when students come in and push, that's when those changes begin to happen. And I think, you know, starting, I believe, with Trayvon Martin, which happened when we were. I mean, I remember in one of our classes, before class started, students stood up and played the police tape. And we sat there and listened to that entire tape before we started our class. And that's the power of students. That changed the entire narrative of the discussion of the course that day and for the rest of the semester, and likely for the last 10 years. And so it's a prop for us as alums who've been students to help shape and push, but also the current students who are here are going to keep pushing and shaping that voice for us as well.
Yeah, I truly feel, as you were saying, that the power of students is key. I remember also during my time, so we organized the first ever French-American Diversity Symposium at the Kennedy School. It was a great success with, you know, our classmates and the students there, and with speakers from the US, from France. And then we organized, I know, under the leadership of, so I had two classmates as well who were sitting at the diversity committees. They organized the Black Commencement. So there are things that, you know, that were happening and that were well received. And I know, but, you know, I don't know all the evolutions, but I know that at the school we do have professors such as Robert Livingstone is doing a great job. He published a book, and we spoke about how to protect communities. And I know that our answers were very light, because at the end of the day, it's about power, and he speaks about sharing power.
Absolutely.
In his book. And I think that, you know, getting to that level of reflection and putting things like that on the table in schools like the Kennedy schools are super important, and definitely a change.
I mean, I think that to Khaleel's point, if students can help drive that conversation, then it's really important to look at who we're admitting, right? And who, because I know that was, that the students here are representative of the country and the world and different backgrounds. And so I do think that, I don't know, because I haven't been back, you know, in the classroom setting or seen like the latest statistics. I feel like we've evolved a lot. I was here in early 2000s. But I think that it's really important that we have different voices, not just in the student level, faculty level, and leadership level, to make sure that equity approach is part of how we teach and how we lead in the world.
And one reference point for me, for those who were at the school in 2011, 2012, the Black Student Public Policy publication was published blank because there were not enough students to contribute. So that just shows you kind of the journey to where we're having this conversation now. I think we still need more voices so those pages can be full and there can be more than one edition, but it's definitely a reference point, an example of great student activism to publish a blank black policy journal. Says a lot of where we were, where we are, but where we still need to go. Yeah. Final question over here in the room to a fellow classmate.
Thanks, Jen. Jesmaine Buchenpoel from South Africa, with Khaleel and Jen in the mid-career MPA class graduating 2012. I'm very excited about this topic, having just launched my online course on Udemy on dealing with the heart of race and gender inequality in the workplace. I encourage you all to do it. And I wanted to ask, how do you sustain the relevance of this discussion? Like I saw after the the unjust killing of George Floyd, it was on everyone's conference agenda. And then there's some conferences I've gone back, and climate change is very important. It's important for all of us. But I'd see conferences who put it, there was a blip when it was very relevant, and then climate change overshadows everything, and DEI goes back at the back foot. And now we've had the Buffalo killings. So I think there's again a care in the media about diversity inclusion, but I think for this topic to succeed, it needs to be seen as ongoing relevant. And how do you do that?
I just want to add there will be no climate justice without racial justice. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind. And you're absolutely right. How do we avoid this from becoming a trend? There's always a danger in that. Thank you for such an important question.
I mean, I think I always go back to, we've seen such a shift in our, at least here in Massachusetts, in our representation in government and at every level, district attorney, Congress, and I think that having leaders who this is in their DNA, quite literally, is important because that doesn't, they're not bringing this as like a trend. They're bringing this as a lived experience and a commitment to their community. So I think that it's really important that we continue to have both political leadership, institutional leadership, that this is part of who they are. And I'm not saying you have to be a person of color, but that having this as a central part of your agenda is really important. It's not just like, oh, we're doing it this year, we're doing it post 2020. I think that gives it lasting power.
Yes, I will say the same. I will stick around. And my job is really to make sure that it is not a trend. That, I always bring the facts. I always, now I'm thinking about, I cannot disclose here, but new projects, but related to disability inclusion, because my focus is not necessarily only on race. But, it's to bring, the research forward. It's to bring the data forward. It's to make people accountable. I spoke about the D&I objective that every single person at my organization does have. So it's really about that and making sure that as we speak about D&I, people do understand the benefits as well. That it's not necessarily something against a group. It's not necessarily something, that will take rights or power out of others. It's really about looking at, what is at play and making sure that everyone, you spoke about equity, everyone has, equal access to opportunities so that at the end of the day, everyone thrives and our societies thrive as well. So it's really about that. And so my role, and I hope that, tomorrow I won't, I will. Sometimes I hear, and I want just to mention that sometimes I hear people tell me that, oh my God, I think that at the end of the day, if everything goes well, we don't need people like you, doing those type of roles in our organizations. And I'm just like, oh my God. So at the end of the day, you did not understand that I am really driving from a value standpoint, and from a performance standpoint. I'm bringing the differences that are needed so that we can do a better work. And when I hear that, I really understand that people don't necessarily understand the core value that D&I functions in our organizations do have. It's like we can have a role of gatekeeping or how do you say that, what we can watch as well, what is going in the right direction or not. But at the end of the day, more than that, we are bringing value on the table, because we are saying, hey, we do have diverse consumers, we do have diverse voters, we do have diverse school students. How can we make sure that their voices are heard? How can we make sure that they do have opportunities? How can we make sure that they are successful? Because that benefits our societies as a whole. And that's super, super important. So, you know, you're speaking about trend. I truly, truly feel that if it's a trend for certain, it's not for all organizations. And at the end of the day, having those type of functions still existing in our organization will help prevent that type of difficulties, if I may say.
We're going to try to get one more question in over here.
All right, so Ruma Samdani, mid-career 2012. So appropriate to close out the question with a classmate. So I work in tech, also corporate, and I also lead some of our sustainability work streams and initiatives. So the way we've been framing some of the climate action and DE&I initiatives is under those pillars of zero waste, zero inequality, which falls under the DE&I social responsibility frame. So part one of the question is, what role does tech have to play? So even though as a tech company, we don't have the responsibility to push for the climate action agenda per se, but we are so pervasive and present in large businesses that we are actually indirectly advocating for policy change. And what we are showcasing through our solutions, at least on the D&I social responsibility factor, is that senior leadership or executive compensation, leadership compensation, managers' compensations is actually tied to DE&I and ESG goals. So going back to Jen, your comment on climate action is not possible without racial justice. So having said that, I guess my real question is, does that really fall under the sustainability lens like we have been framing it? And also, what is the role of tech?
I mean, the tech is everything, everywhere, like measuring the data, disaggregated data. It's being able to put the gender and name that you want on your work email. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's so, there's so many tech angles, but
it's both a challenge and opportunity.
A challenge and opportunity, and it's been, yeah, it's like my husband is a Black computer engineer, and he was able to get into that field because it was colorblind, and you know, like it's like, can you program or not, right? People didn't care what suit you wore to your interview, right? And so I think that it's a great, it's too big of a sector to encapsulate neatly, but I think that as we're designing programs that are how we're interacting with the world and everything is moving like contactless and everything, like making sure that those systems take into account, you know, economic inequity, racial difference. I mean, you've seen all the promotions with Google's new camera that picks up different skin tone, you know, like it's in everything, but it's a, you know, tech is a vital piece of both a challenge and an opportunity.
Which was created with a Harvard professor, by the way. It's based on a study.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. I was going to say that one thing the pandemic taught us is how the power of technology can advance and innovate when we're forced to, right? And so I think in both of the topics you're talking about, Ruma, the pandemic forced us to find new modalities on how to teach, new modalities on how to communicate and connect with each other, how to use predictive analytics to think about COVID and COVID tests and COVID cases rising, and even also how to use tech for different resources we take for granted. I mean, I think one of the challenges that is both a sustainability and a DEI through line is mental health, and the impact of both of those things on mental health and the ability for tech to find different ways to get resources for people that I don't think as a society we paid attention to. And so I have seen both of those really held up to the same standard of these are really, really important, and if we're not doing this as an organization then we're not going to exist as an organization, right? And Axelle said it, George-Axelle said it best. You know, the 2020 U.S. Census data shows a path that says we're going to be a majority-minority country. It's coming whether you like it or not, and either you can be prepared for it or you cannot. And that's the business case I make when I talk to organizations who want to work with me. You will either be behind or you will be ahead. And you can choose right now, but it's happening whether you're ready to make that change or not.
Yeah.
And technology offers a way forward and a path to accelerate some of those challenges. And so when you think about the work that's happening with DEI, the ability to find resources or to find new ways to gather and capture data of students is really, really special. And also thinking about ways in which you're tracking and measuring sustainability, LEED certification, all of these things that are out there. Tech can be used as a lever that can be pulled, right? And I think the pandemic taught us that it generally only happens when there's a crisis or it becomes necessary. And so how do you keep that impetus and that momentum and that pressure that allows tech to keep pushing those boundaries so that we're making advances on both sides?
I'm going to jump in just on the note of time and in regards to your question on climate, another acronym, ESG, environment, good governance, sustainability. I think that we're seeing a connection to DEI at a corporate board level, and I think there's a natural overlap in intersectionality. We don't need to be competing with each other. I think we've seen at a School of Government that all this work is connected. So thank you so much to our leaders in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thanks to everyone for joining us in the room and online. And I'd like to invite, I believe, Karen to join us to give us an update on what's coming up next with this reunion. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your comments and for your time and for the fascinating and dynamic discussion. I know I've learned a lot and I really appreciate it. And up next, we have the Center Open House from 4:30 to 5:30 that will be led by students. So if you're interested in participating in those, please meet in the Sunshine Lobby. And you'll be paired with a student and they will bring you to various centers around the school. We have 9 that will be open with their faculty, staff, students, and their materials. And then at 5:30, please join us in the tent outside for our opening reception that will include live music. And we look forward to the next few programs. So thank you so much.